Most Americans don't arrive in Australia expecting to feel comfortable so quickly. They expect a new country, new habits, and a period of adjustment. What surprises them instead is how fast Australia feels familiar, not because it's the same as home, but because it doesn't make you feel like an outsider from the start. Americans typically brace themselves for culture shock, language barriers, social confusion, and that awkward phase of not knowing how things work or how to behave appropriately. They arrive prepared to be the obvious foreigner, to make mistakes, to struggle with customs and norms they don't understand. But Australia disrupts those expectations almost immediately. Within days, sometimes even hours, Americans find themselves navigating the country with surprising ease, not because everything is identical to what they know, but because the differences don't create barriers or judgment. There's no sense of being constantly evaluated, no feeling that locals are watching to see if you'll measure up to their standards, no underlying tension about whether you belong. This absence of social friction is so unusual for Americans, accustomed to more stratified, more judgmental social environments, that many don't even recognize it consciously at first. They just notice they feel surprisingly relaxed, surprisingly accepted, surprisingly at home in a place they just arrived. And that feeling, once they become aware of it, becomes one of the most memorable aspects of their Australian experience. From the first few interactions, many Americans notice how relaxed everyday conversations feel. There's no pressure to explain yourself, no need to perform or impress. People speak casually, listen casually, and move on without judgment, which creates a quiet sense of ease that settles in faster than expected. In America, even casual conversations often carry subtext. People are assessing your education, your status, your usefulness, your position in social hierarchies. Small talk frequently includes questions designed to place you: where you work, where you went to school, where you live, what you do. These questions aren't necessarily malicious, but they create an environment where every interaction involves subtle evaluation and positioning. In Australia, conversations tend to skip past these status markers entirely. People ask about your interests, your experiences, your opinions, but rarely in ways that feel like assessment or judgment. There's genuine curiosity without the underlying competition that colors so many American interactions. Australians also have a remarkable ability to make conversations feel significant without being heavy. They engage authentically, but don't demand emotional intensity or deep revelation. This creates space for Americans to relax into interactions without constantly managing impressions or worrying about saying the wrong thing. The conversational ease extends across contexts, too. Talking to baristas, co-workers, neighbors, or strangers at the beach all feel similarly comfortable, without the rigid, context-dependent social rules Americans navigate at home. In Australia, social interactions often feel lighter and more equal. Titles, status, and background rarely dominate conversations. You're met as a person first, not as where you're from or what you do, and for many Americans, that absence of social tension is one of the first things they notice. Australia's cultural egalitarianism isn't just a nice idea. It's actively practiced in daily interactions in ways that surprise Americans accustomed to more hierarchical social structures. In America, people constantly signal and recognize status through subtle markers: brands worn, schools attended, neighborhoods lived in, jobs held. These signals create invisible but powerful social rankings that shape how people interact with each other. But in Australia, there's a cultural resistance to these hierarchies. Deliberately displaying wealth or status is considered tacky rather than impressive. Bragging about achievements invites mockery rather than admiration. People bond over shared humanity rather than shared status, over humor and authenticity rather than accomplishments and possessions. This doesn't mean Australia has no class distinctions or inequalities. It certainly does. But the everyday performance of those distinctions is much more muted than in America. Americans notice this immediately when they realize that nobody cares about their impressive job title, expensive car, or prestigious university degree. What matters instead is whether you're genuine, whether you can laugh at yourself, whether you treat others with basic respect regardless of their position. This leveling effect can feel disorienting to Americans whose identities are heavily tied to their achievements, but most eventually find it liberating. Public spaces also play a role in this feeling. Cafes, parks, beaches, and even public transport feel open without being intrusive. Conversations happen naturally, but silence is equally respected, creating an environment where people feel comfortable simply existing without pressure. Americans are often struck by how usable and welcoming Australian public spaces feel, not just physically well-designed, but socially comfortable. In many American cities, public space can feel either lonely or threatening, either empty or filled with people who carefully avoid interaction. But in Australia, public spaces feel genuinely shared and communal without forcing interaction. It's perfectly acceptable to strike up a conversation with a stranger at the beach, but it's equally acceptable to sit alone without anyone bothering you or making you feel unwelcome. This balance between openness and privacy, between community and solitude, creates an atmosphere where Americans feel they can engage as much or as little as they want without judgment either way. The design of public spaces reinforces this comfort. Abundant seating that isn't defensive or hostile, cafes with outdoor areas that blur the line between private consumption and public community, beaches that belong to everyone rather than being privatized or commercialized. Americans notice that Australians actually use these spaces regularly, that public life is vibrant and valued rather than something people retreat from. This creates opportunities for organic social connection without the forced or transactional quality that characterizes many American public interactions. Another unexpected shift is the pace of social life. There's less urgency to rush interactions and less expectation to constantly stay busy. For Americans used to faster social rhythms, this slower, more balanced approach can feel surprisingly refreshing and grounding over time. If this kind of real-world perspective resonates with you, take a moment to subscribe to Global Encounters for more stories like this. Americans are conditioned to maximize efficiency in all areas of life, including socializing. Friendships are scheduled, conversations are time-limited, and there's constant awareness of what else you should be doing. But in Australia, social time expands more naturally. Coffee meetings stretch into long conversations without anyone checking their watch anxiously. Weekend gatherings unfold over entire afternoons rather than tightly scheduled blocks. There's cultural permission to simply spend time together without agenda or productivity goals. This doesn't mean Australians are lazy or unambitious. They work hard and accomplish plenty, but they maintain clearer boundaries between work time and lifetime, between productive hours and restorative hours. Americans notice that their Australian friends and colleagues seem less stressed, less rushed, less burdened by the constant pressure to optimize every moment. This slower pace initially frustrates some Americans who interpret it as lack of ambition or drive, but most eventually recognize it as a healthier, more sustainable approach to life. The realization that you can be successful without sacrificing your well-being, that you can build meaningful relationships without scheduling them like business meetings, fundamentally challenges American assumptions about how life must be lived. What stands out most isn't exaggerated friendliness or forced hospitality. It's consistency. Day after day, interactions remain calm, respectful, and uncomplicated. That reliability builds trust, and slowly a sense of belonging begins to form without effort. Americans are used to variability in social treatment. How you're treated depends heavily on context, on who you know, on what you can offer, on unspoken social rules that change by situation. But in Australia, there's remarkable consistency in how people interact across different contexts. The person who serves your coffee treats you with the same casual respect as your coworker, your neighbor, a stranger at the park. There's no dramatic shift between public face and private behavior, no exhausting need to adjust your personality for different audiences. This consistency means Americans can relax their constant social monitoring and code switching. They don't have to work as hard to figure out the rules of each new situation because the fundamental approach remains similar. Casual, respectful, humor-oriented, egalitarian. Over time, this reliability creates a foundation of trust that Americans didn't even realize they were missing. They stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, stop expecting betrayal or judgment, stop maintaining defensive barriers against social threat. The belonging that develops isn't based on dramatic welcomes or explicit inclusion. It's based on the gradual realization that you're being treated exactly like everyone else, that there's no hidden hierarchy you need to navigate, that you can simply be yourself without constant performance or anxiety. Many Americans later realize that Australia doesn't try to make newcomers feel welcome in obvious ways. Instead, it removes the barriers that usually make people feel different. There's no spotlight on being new, foreign, or unfamiliar, and that subtle approach makes all the difference. In many countries, being a foreigner means constant awareness of your outsider status. People either treat you as exotic and interesting or as suspicious and unwelcome, but either way, you're always aware you're different. Australia's approach is neither welcoming nor unwelcoming in the traditional sense. It's simply inclusive by default. Australians don't make a big deal about newcomers because they assume that if you're here, and that's enough. There's no need to prove yourself, earn acceptance, or demonstrate you deserve to be included. The multicultural nature of Australian cities means that being from somewhere else is completely normal and unremarkable. Nobody assumes you need to assimilate completely or abandon your original culture, but nobody treats you as permanently foreign either. You're simply incorporated into the flow of daily life without fanfare. This low-key inclusion works particularly well for Americans because it allows them to maintain their identity while adapting at their own pace. There's no pressure to become Australian, but there's also no barrier preventing them from feeling Australian if they choose. The flexibility and lack of rigid definition around belonging means Americans can find their place without forcing themselves into uncomfortable molds or giving up core aspects of who they are. That's why so many Americans describe Australia as welcoming, even when they didn't expect to. Not because everything is perfect, but because the culture allows people to feel comfortable being themselves. If you've experienced life in Australia or are curious about it, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Global Encounters for more calm, honest stories from around the world. The Australian approach to social integration offers lessons that extend beyond immigration. It demonstrates how cultures can be inclusive without demanding conformity, how communities can be cohesive without being exclusive, how people can maintain strong shared values while respecting individual differences. Americans who experience this often return home with different perspectives on what community and belonging actually require. They realize that the barriers they encountered in America, the constant evaluation, the status competition, the pressure to perform, aren't inevitable features of social life but specific cultural choices that could be made differently. Whether they ultimately stay in Australia, return to America, or move somewhere else entirely, the experience of feeling genuinely comfortable and accepted in a new place changes how they understand themselves and what they want from their communities. So share your story. Whether you've lived this experience or observed it from outside, whether you agree with this perspective or see it differently, every voice adds nuance and depth to our collective understanding of how different cultures create belonging and what we might learn from comparing those approaches.